Welcome to this Atlas Leadership Series session webinar um, presented by Onboard. If you are here for the art of asking questions in the boardroom with Lynn McDonald, you are in the right place at the right time. And we'll give it about one more minute here before we get started. All right, again, welcome. We'll go ahead and kick it off here. My name is Josh Palmer, Head of Content for Onboard. Thank you for joining us today. We're with Lynn McDonald today, who is a great author, speaker, and board governance consultant. She's going to be sharing some of the insights she's gleaned over the years about the art of asking questions, which I think is an essential art, the art of the interrogative in the boardroom. Some light housekeeping just to keep everybody on the same page as we start our session today. Everybody is mute by default. That's for your sake and ours on the Zoom webinar platform. We do highly encourage participation in today's session. We've already gotten a couple questions via email, so that's great. So there's a live Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. You can use that. Or if you prefer to use the chat feature to speak with other audience members or the panels directly, you can use that as well. I'll be monitoring and active in both. There will be one poll question about halfway through the show, and then there will be another poll question from Onboard specifically towards the end of the show. It only takes about 15 seconds and simply helps us understand how we can do a better job to serve your needs as webinar participants. And before we get started with today's session or the content of today's session, a little bit about who or what Onboard is. Onboard is a board portal software provider. Our mission and our vision is to inspire and enable organizations, board-led organizations, that is, to do their best work in a digital-first world that we all live in today. We currently serve more than 5,000 board-led organizations. There are 12,000 committees. We host more than 55,000 board meetings each year within the board management platform of Onboard, more than 100,000 subscribers, and we're truly a global organization with presence in more than 50 countries. And this is an old, if you've joined us before, you've heard me say this before, this is an old familiar chestnut from our co-founder and CEO, Parun Chadha. He says there are three types of board meetings. There's the board meeting that you prepared for, the board meeting that you had, and the board meeting that you wish you had. And at Onboard, it's always our goal to make sure you have that third type of board meeting. You can find us here if you haven't already. And then without further ado, I'm very excited to introduce you our speaker today, Lynn McDonald. She is the president of the Accountability Group, which is a board governance consultant firm. She's a course leader at York University in Toronto. Most importantly, she's the author of the chapter in this current and upcoming third editions of the Handbook of Board Governance. This is how I found Lynn here in my second edition of the Handbook of Board Governance of the Art of Asking Questions. If you have not read that chapter and you have that book, it's essential reading in my view. She's also a fellow certified management consultant and a charter director, and she served on the boards of the Institute of Certified Managements of Ontario and the Scarborough Hospital in Toronto. Lynn, it's a great pleasure to introduce you. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Josh. And I love those three types of meetings, and I think we're aiming towards the third, of course, in this session.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Thanks, everybody, for your interest. Let me share my screen so I can relax and get started here. So it's a real pleasure to address this topic because I'm very passionate about it. I believe that the art of asking questions is a necessary skill today, but it's going to be even more important going forward. And that's because we're facing such great disruption. And over the next 5, 10 years, I mean, it's going to continue. And what we need is to adapt and be future fit in our organizations, and to have conversations with each other and with management and with stakeholders, that really help transform things. And this session was kind of born in my observation and my experience, looking at so many boards, observing so many boards, and being a chair, a director, and most of all, a consultant, seeing many organizations and their proceedings this is not true for all boards, but many boards have kind of are in a lull of formality and routine, and there's kind of a pomp to the meeting, and we need to be able to disrupt that in a gentle and constructive way to have the conversations that we need. So the reason why that's important is because boards are in the best position to evolve organizational purposes, organizational models, shift priorities. So having boards that are having authentic conversations is really important for the future. And I think directors are the human algorithm to make sure those conversations happen. So we need directors to be able to skillfully put forward, and in what I call a relentlessly constructive manner, to put forward questions in a way that is skillful, that is clear, that gets at issues, and that doesn't trigger themselves or others, so that we are able to address them and go forward. And what I love about questions is that they deepen the conversation of a board, and they ensure they kind of pull out the meaning of items and the business on the table to make connections to bigger issues. So very important. So the purpose of this session is, of course, I'll share some techniques in terms of the art of asking questions, but it really is that deeper board purpose towards shaping the organization for the future and stepping up to do that in a way that's safe and enabling for everyone. And I also am aware with this format that, there's lots of experience in the room. You would have tips and insights as well. So I want to honor that and respect that. We won't have time to tap all of that, but I am well aware that there are people in the room who do these kinds of things very well. So what we're going to cover, and I'll do it hopefully in a soldierly fast fashion, is that what board questions do, like what are the functions of board questions. I want to relate it to the responsibilities of the board, because that's what really underlies the purpose of questions, the nature of your questions. We'll look a little bit around the perspective of the board vis-a-vis the staff or management group, because that then gives you the intent and the tone of your questions. We'll do a short pause, and then we'll cover techniques for asking questions, and I'll point you at the end to a framework that may be helpful. And we should have time for questions at the end. My very good friend always says, less is more. I'm not sure in this case. I've pulled out only a few nuggets from the deeper exploration done in the second edition and the third edition, which is an update of that chapter. So I commend those resources to you for further study, because this is kind of skimming the surface, but hopefully you'll get some good nuggets here. First, about questions and about directors who make a difference. We've learned from board evaluations and peer assessments that often there is a small number, well, let's say 1/3, 1/2 if we're lucky, of board members who actively engage in the agenda, who, enter the discussion, they offer perspectives, and they ask questions. And then there is another cohort who are rather bystanders. They're quite quiet. They do, they listen well, they do, follow the business. They certainly vote, but they don't necessarily ask questions or offer their perspective, and we kind of lose their voice at the meeting. And there's a wonderful chapter in the second edition by Tobias and Pallotta, who are the authors, and they set out what qualities that board members who make a difference have. And although it's an ideal and not everyone is perfect, I think these are kind of what we're getting at. So one is, they sort of set out voice and value, that effective directors have voice and value. So voice is speaking with regularity without dominating, choosing appropriate timing, having a constructive tone in the meeting, being able to be heard literally, that they have a strong enough volume of voice, the confidence of delivery and standing behind what they say, and the clarity and conciseness of their remarks, such that there's no big speeches. And then what value is, as they describe it, is the relevance of the comments, the line of thinking and insight offered, the preparedness, the strategic application of expertise, and sometimes like the connecting of dots between issues, and of course, asking questions. And I think what we're trying to get at in this webinar is all of those things combined in the particular means of asking questions. So this is the poll. It's not halfway, it's a little sooner, but why don't directors ask questions? Like, we know they're important. Why don't board members speak up during the meeting? And let's make this a poll. Ask your opinion. There's no wrong answer. All of these are situational. So, pick the one that resonates with you as kind of a main one that you would think often is the case, and we'll see what the results say. Okay, so we have fear of asking a dumb question. My goodness, see how, oh, yeah, that's the significant one. And then we have a tie between not wanting to make others feel uncomfortable. That's interesting. We'll definitely deal with that. And and the one that I also see often, everyone else seems fine with it, so I'm not going to rock the boat. That's great. Josh, are you surprised with these results? Anything you would say?
No, I would not. I would tend to be unsurprised if that's okay. I think that the fear of asking a dumb question is probably universal, maybe just only second to fear of public speaking for most people. But yeah, I think there is also, I think it's notable to say, not making others feel uncomfortable, maybe having difficulty asking a very pointed question that may require a bit of candor or earnestness. And then I do think, and I've heard this in past sessions with board governance consultants and board directors, that there is a certain element of group think, even if that's not explicitly expressed, that there's kind of an implicit bias to kind of go with the flow or not rock the boat there. So yeah, I think these are some interesting results for sure.
Thank you, Josh. And you can close those results now. Around the going with the flow and the group think, I once read that, and this is a remarkable thing that I read. I'm not sure who said it. I wish I could remember or who wrote it, but it was that board culture is as strong as gang culture. Oh my goodness, right? Like that there is a culture on the board, and it is something that you kind of have to fit into. And I will address that later, because I think we both need to respect and honor the identity of the group, but we also have to have gentle and effective ways of disrupting that. There's two I just want to comment on a few things. One is even number 1, number 2, and number 5 are very much in the realm of what chairs can do. So if you are a chair of a board or even a committee, there's ways in which you can surface questions and make it easier for people to ask even the dumb questions, or what they feel is a dumb question. I remember 2 chairs I had on boards I served. One was Mike, the other one was Janet, and both did a fabulous job as chairs of setting the table for the discussion. They would first not allow staff to make overly lengthy presentations of what everyone should have already read. So they were absolutely strict on that. They expected substance from us and would say things like, this is the importance of the topic to the board and the benefit of the sober reflection that the board can give it, asking what's best for the organization. So like they really set the table. And they also set out terms of engagement that they wanted to hear from everyone, and they made sure they did, and didn't allow repeaters until everybody was heard. And like there are some things that boards can do. There's 2 other reasons that come up that might be number 7, and they and in some of your settings you may be thinking of them, and feel free to put in chat if there's in numbers for other circumstances that you can see. what I'm thinking of here is when you're in a public organization who's committed to transparency, like a public good organization, or you have this open board meeting where you have a gallery, you have observers, sometimes you even have the media. And that is a very dampening thing for directors. It's sort of intimidating to have this audience, right, watching. Now, we know that the audience wants to see a substantive board meeting. And we don't want to shy away from the business of the board because we have observers. So there's ways in which we can overcome that we'll talk about, but I think that is one of the reasons why sometimes people are shy in such a setting of asking questions, is because there's an audience. The other reason that may come up is that an individual may assume that a committee has already discussed it. And what we hope committee chairs do is that as they bring their recommendations or their insights forward, that they identify the dimensions of the issue that were discussed in the committee, so that the board has satisfaction that it had a robust discussion and certain issues were discussed. It may still be that a board member may want to get the assurance directly and to have it recorded in the minutes, but that certainly can be another dampening reason. And Josh, if there's anybody who's put in another reason, I'd love to hear it to add to my list.
Yeah, there was a great question actually that came over for email ahead of the show. One question is can the board staff, such as an executive assistant, ask questions during the session? I know it's probably typically not the standard procedure, but is there a time and a place where an executive assistant could pipe up and have a question to ask?
I think that's a tricky one, because the nature of a board meeting is that it is the board directors in conversation with themselves and management, and questions usually come from the board to management, and the executive assistant may be kind of taking over that that role of driving the conversation when it is not his or her conversation or their conversation to have or to initiate. So it's a sensitive area. Certainly, if it's something that supports the work of the executive assistant, where they would need information and guidance from the board regarding that, would be something different. But a question that's unrelated to their own responsibilities would probably not necessarily always land well, and there should be good judgment exercised.
Absolutely. And one more reason Pastor Mary Sanders shared with us is, maybe this kind of aligns well, and I think it goes to a later part of the presentation here, is that maybe they don't understand the statement or the description of the agenda item, so they're loath to ask questions, and maybe they're waiting for that committee report or that agenda item to be better described in more detail.
That's a great point. And of course, the creation of an agenda is an opportunity to set up the right discussion. So the clarity of that, and great chairs or chairs have the option of indicating where they would like the board to direct its attention regarding an item. That might be in the briefing sheet, such that the board is asked to consider the risk aspects of this, or the implications for our commitment to XXX, in this matter. So at times, that clarity that's in the agenda itself is so helpful for people, because then they can, kind of point their mind and give some thought to, what they would say, how, and any further questions they have. But certainly we would hope agendas be clear. And it's certainly fine to ask at the outset, because if it's not clear, what is the purpose of this item? And sometimes you can see, like, for discussion or for information or for decision. But yeah, the director has an obligation to get what they need in order to, enter the dialogue. All right, is that good?
Yeah, that's great. And yeah, we have a couple more questions, but you're going to cover that later in the presentation here.
Okay, and this is not our official pause yet, so we'll pick those up if need be. So what questions accomplish is so much. Like, they're gathering information, they're gaining understanding, they're pulling out sort of, key things that might be missing in what's presented, they're testing assumptions, they're making sure considerations were were in play as plans were done. They're basically, making plans better. Questions are probably the second most potent tool in the back pocket of a board member. And what's the first most potent tool is making a motion. But next, I think, are questions, because they direct the focus of the board, the management, a committee, to something that may be important. And I was thinking this morning, it's almost like an image of hard ground that's kind of walked over, and you just sort of rather thoughtlessly, and instead, you don't stop and dig in and turn over the soil and aerate it, and kind of getting back to a board meeting, understand something more deeply. And when one of the most important things that boards do is they build sort of their general understanding of things together, and questions, do that kind of aeration of and opening up of something that allows sort of that deeper understanding. Or they are a board member bringing a matter to the table that's that they might think is important, and this can be quite consequential, where you might have a board member saying, I went to this conference and I think this might have impact for us over time. Here it is. What do you think? Right? Because we need board members to sort of be those scouts on the environment, and to raise things and direct the board's attention and management's attention to something that might be important. They also do, and this is my most important point, is they transform a board meeting to genuine dialogue. So we change up the pro forma routine of a board meeting. We change up that kind of performative sort of thing that we can get into, where everyone plays their roles beautifully, and board business proceeds, it's all neat and tucked away as you go. But, in order to have real conversations, you have to interrupt the status quo. And that allows you to kind of hear different points of view, get a more nuanced view of something, and avoid the groupthink, and make better decisions ultimately. So that ability for questions to transform and suddenly make a real conversation in the boardroom is gold. And that's what we need. And we need that more and more going forward, because we can otherwise be, it's complacent, and we're sort of overvaluing stability and continuity. And in our environment, it may be very important to raise some questions that might have some discomfort to them, but best raise them now. And how do you do that? And these last two about board having the board influencing kind of its own culture, but also management. So if management knows that the board can grapple with things maturely and constructively, they can grow more confident that it can bring its questions, its real dilemmas and challenges to the table in a truly safe way. So, and I think that then grows the reputation of the board in the organization and changes the culture. It feels like, and it is a more authentic place. Okay, so we know questions are great, but how do you know what questions to ask? So let's lean into the role of the board, because many of the answers are there, at least questions in the process of oversight. So real flesh and blood people, as you know, have to be in charge of incorporated organizations, and it's the board. So accountability stretches from purpose through to performance, or to achieving the goals and objectives and the vision and the future that's desired for the organization. And that accountability, even more profoundly, is ensuring the relevance and sustainability of the organization into the future. And in our wildly changing world, where so much is that this particular role becomes more important. Boards have to make the big choices, and there are many of them, to get from A to B. And they have to make sure the organization is fit for purpose, that it's achieving its objectives, that it's serving the stakeholders, however defined, that it's solvent, that it's acting always in ways that are legal and ethical, that it meets its obligations as a good citizen in that sort of wider sense, and it's being resourceful in the use of resources, because resources are always limited. And boards have management or staff to help, but the buck stops with the board and not with its agents. And it does this job with sufficient dialogue and questions that drive that dialogue all the way along to constantly adjust to the external world and developments, with the goal to make that better, wiser, more informed decisions, and adjusting B is necessary. And I think B's kind of moving right now. B is on the move in terms of what is the future that we want, what is the impact that we need. So boards can't be sleepy and complacent and overvalue kind of the way it's always been done, being overly faithful to the past, but instead, with great discernment, have to ask questions around, how we are doing things, where we are going, what is needed now, and so forth. So this is kind of an obvious slide, but I just want to, it's worth saying that questions are in the context of board responsibilities. So it's not that we are coming and generating questions on the activities of the organization or even kind of the details randomly inside an agenda topic. It's not like how many people attended that event, or what are the features of the new product again, or I'm in real estate, so I'm interested in. Its questions should be to the responsibilities of the board each director shares in that job, and questions are prompted by business on the table related to these duties, or that should be on the table. This is kind of a fun image. If we were in a workshop, we'd have more fun with it because we could spend more time. And once I had a wall climber in the workshop who really ran with this. Let's talk about the intent and the tone of questions, understanding the basic relationship to management and the staff team. And that's because it really leads to your the attitude that you bring to asking questions. And the metaphor obviously is a climbing wall. Management is on the wall. The board is standing on the ground observing. And the wall is strategy, and the goal is to get to the top. So you could pretend, that the wall is this organizational strategies. And I'll ask you these questions and just note, think about what goes through your mind. So what challenges would the wall represent? What would be tough about going up that wall? What must be the concerns of management on the wall as management is moving along? What must they be able to do very well? What will they consider helpful from the board? What is not so helpful? And thinking of the board represented by the person on the ground, what role can the board play? What concerns will it have observing? What are the advantages of the more distant position that they have? How can they provide support? Now, you probably, and welcome anything in the chat, but you probably thought of concepts of flexibility for management as they're on the wall. The adjustment to capacity, there's sort of some timing issues as well. Like you can't, like rushing up, it may not even be possible. It's like you have to make your way. It's having clear goals, but the optionality to decide how to reach them. It's about the appreciation of good kit and equipment, and strong ropes and support, and the appreciation of encouragement from the board. And for the board, I'm sure concepts of the role of risk oversight, of ensuring management has the skill to climb in the first place, the equipping, making sure that they have what they need as they go, the support if things go awry, and of course, seeing the bigger picture, what's to the right and the left of the wall of the organizational space, and asking, are we even on the right wall? So this is my antidote image, I guess, to the one, the classic one about being in the weeds, and seeing oversight as of a whole system and management doing its best to achieve goals and closer to the action, and needing that discovery by doing. Like not everything is going to be as linear as we might think. It's going to be more opportunistic and and how advice may not be so well received, like that handhold. No, this, put your foot here, right? It would be too specific. They need to have that freedom. And the board, with that bigger picture um, there's a protective view that's in that perspective. So yeah, so we're now ready to address the techniques of asking questions, but Josh, first we'll do a pause. What do you think of that metaphor? And yeah, maybe start there, and then we can pivot to any questions or comments that you're seeing that you want to share with us.
Yeah, absolutely. I love some of the topics we've spoken about in the preparation sessions just totally lend themselves to that image or that metaphor. Being able to see the route, that management might not see the route to the next handhold or to the top of the wall. I love the very pointed question you had of what happens as they get further up the wall. It becomes harder to see the individual milestones are probably less clear for the board. And then for anybody who's ever been in that belay position, absolutely a risk management approach of if and when that faller climbs, you have to be on that belay to arrest that descent, which has so many just great metaphors for business and organizations there.
Josh, what did you call that position? Is that
the belay position? Yeah.
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 Oh, okay.
The safety rope, I guess you would call it. Yeah, as well.
Any question, anything coming up in the comments that you'd like to?
Yeah. So one question is to encourage better decision making or better questions. A question about questions. Is there a particular model that boards or organizations could adopt to increase the candor, increase the opportunities for questions to arise? I would assume that's a chair role, or perhaps something within the charter that kind of designates the culture. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on that from one of our audience members.
That's a really good question. Later on, I'll show you like kind of like a oversight framework, but I think the individual is also getting at sort of the culture and creating that free flow of candid exchange. It relates a little bit to, and you folks will recognize this because of the pandemic, is that relationships between everyone really matter. So outside the boardroom, people knowing each other, having a little bit of social time, because it almost like lubricates in the boardroom that sense of I can speak up, I'll be supported. So that may not be quite what the person's getting at, but it does come to mind as being a critical ingredient for building board culture of candor and teamwork and with management, and having those occasions where people are together informally really do help. And that's what we had such a struggle with in the pandemic, where people were just meeting each other and seeing each other only on Zoom for such a long time. So hopefully, I think that will continue, but I do think that relationships make a difference. It also is, a good solid orientation and telling people that we need you. You are supported as you come into the board to bring your full and capable selves, and knowing that, we want a culture of inquiry. And there are some techniques in terms of we know this in facilitation, is that if you engage the board early, if you engage a group early, they're engaged for the rest of the day. If they're only so something that right at the beginning allows people, like even just like do a check-in or something that just gets people talking, and there's no big risk in it. They're just sharing something that is actually quite important for establishing the candor that we need, because at least you get their voice in the room. So I'll leave it at that. Am I fading a little bit there?
You just went to autofocus there just a little bit.
Let me just see if I can address that. That's kind of funny.
Great question from Darla here to that effect of for those remote boards, are there frameworks for getting to know your other directors or board members? Maybe you can address that later. But just that whole remote setting that we're so used to now is the complete antithesis, as you mentioned, of that that pre-board dinner, or that water cooler moment with another board member that you might not have otherwise connected with.
it is kind of offside to this topic, but I will say that what some boards can do, have done in this, is like they have a 15 so minutes or a social hour before the meeting, such that people are put in small groups and they just have an opportunity to exchange before the meeting, so that they're meeting each other and having just a regular conversation. They're not doing any business. They're just getting to know one another. And it, like, sometimes that's that formality, right? That's that the pomp and the routine of business. Sometimes we can put these other elements in, and it's not hard, and it's the kind of thing that people really will like. They won't want to spend too much time for obvious reasons, but a 15-minute kind of, and you have to make sure everybody's there, or ideally, because it kind of needs to be an all hands on board thing. And you could even like drop it in as a bit of a surprise at the beginning, so that people don't make the decision, oh, I'm not going to do that because it's not board business yet. But they'll like it if it happens and it deepens relationships. All right, onward. So tips, this is, what you probably came to the session for, was the tips for asking questions effectively. And we've addressed now both a little bit the substantive role and the attitude and perspective of a board. So as we turn to technique, good questions are prepared in advance. So when we receive materials, we're going to scan them lightly. Our brains need time to absorb and orient. And board packages can be very long and dense, hundreds of pages. So we're just going to see what's there. We're going to review the agenda. We're going to note key discussions. And we know those usually by how many minutes are, where the time is. We use a highlighter, even on a PDF. You can do that with a reader, and you can underline essential points. You can trace the logic paths, and you source your own insight and gut. You say, what needs to go right? Like what will this change? Who's affected? You write down your comments and questions. And one of my mentors, Dr. Richard LeBlanc, the editor, he talks about coming up with, 3, 4, 5 questions. A good discipline changes the way we read. It doesn't mean that you'll necessarily ask them, because they might come out otherwise, but you come into the room thoughtfully. And around that public meeting, so going back to the gallery, it is certainly possible to give, and it's a good idea, and it's certainly considerate, to give a heads up mention to the presenter that you're going to just raise a question on such and such, what's the seeming difference from plan and what's happening and why, or whatever. If it's an interest and a relevant question for the whole board, you're going to keep the answer there. You're not bypassing the board. You're giving a heads up to the individual so they can collect their thoughts and have an immediate answer, or get information. You're not scaring anybody that there's going to be a hammer over their head. It's just a quick note. It's a brief conversation. It's a courtesy. And during the meeting, you're going to tune in and be present. And I'm grateful to have benefited from the insights of Christo Norden Powers, who wrote a book, Powerful Questions That Highly Effective Business Leaders Ask. And he has such clarity on the use of these techniques. It's referenced in the handbooks, both chapters. But when we come into the meeting, we're tuning in, we're present, we're listening with a beginner's mind. We're not like holding our questions, waiting for the moment. We're devoting ourselves to the role, listening for, that logic. Does everything make sense? Is there anything fuzzy? Does anything sound like spin? Or, we're just, it's like listening with diligence. And we're observing nonverbal cues. We're feeling into the tone of the room. And we're respecting other directors, the presenters, the role of the chair. We wait our turn if necessary, and we certainly choose the right time. And we, are always mindful of the relationships in the room. And the respect is also what can realistically be answered, and with what degree of audience. With what degree of confidence, sorry. I'm reminded of a situation on a board I worked with. The finance and audit chair was a financial whiz. I mean, she was on everything financial. And she had the view that the CEO should have much better grasp, should know the details on certain financial matters. And she would surprise him at a finance and audit meeting or board meeting with questions on very specific things, and then be visibly disgruntled when he did not have immediate answers. And he became very defensive and would show that. And before you know it, the board saw the escalation of tension at the meetings, at the board meetings, between these two individuals. And they became especially concerned because the finance and audit chair was next in line to be the board chair. Now that got sorted out, but it demonstrated so well the give and take of questions and answers, the importance of reasonableness, and how maintaining positive atmosphere in a meeting, pulls out and allows everybody to give their best work. She did not become chair, by the way. Okay, so how do you voice questions? How do you bring questions into the room? One is, of course, be clear about what you're asking. Frame your question. Just make sure you're not asking for a story. You're asking for a dimension. You're going to ask for assurance of something. Was something, did we learn from it? Have things been put in place? It's not like what happened. That will get a long story. So you want to instead be very clear about what you're asking and think about it in advance. And ideally, you would have written some things down. And I want to talk about and really emphasize this lead into it and maintain flow. And this becomes important in these public meetings because there's almost like, it's like, it's a river and you don't want to suddenly throw a big rock in. And instead you are you're maintaining that, neutral conversation. You're leading into it, and gentle lead-ins or softeners can kind of prepare the person, and you're asking for help. It's not their miscommunication. It rather is you seeking to understand better. You sort of put the onus on you. And it allows, everybody knows what you're doing. They're just thinking you're really diplomatic. So, you say things like, I'm wondering if you can just explain to me more, or it would help me greatly if or I need to get a better picture of, or a clear picture of this. I'm not sure I understand. Can you explain or outline? I'm curious. Well, you see, I've always started with and I haven't sort of suggested that they haven't done a good job in doing their presentation or including something. Norton Powers calls this the Columbo method. So if you remember Columbo, this is going to date me, but Peter Falk, he was a detective, and he'd do an interview with, these potential suspects, and then he leaves, thanks them very much, and then he turns back and he sort of shuffles, a little bit, and he says, I'm curious. There's one thing that's kind of on, I'm just curious about, and then of course he'd ask his question, and it was his style that, and we're sort of talking about that style, that it's really getting the person to ally with you to answer the question because you are curious. It just works better. And this adding emotions or opinions, you want to come at it without charge and without all your emotions. And I'm reminded myself when I was a young board member, I remember my board mentor took me aside and said, Lynn, you have lots to give, but you're coming across too passionate, too hot, and you need to, and I remember this, you need to become a cool medium. You'll be more effective if you kind of take the charge out of what you're saying and just kind of put things on the table more neutrally. I thought that was great advice. And I remembered that. And it also reminds me of the wonderful advice from negotiators, Roger Fisher and William Ury, in their excellent book, Getting to Yes. And they talk about being hard on the problem and soft on the people. So for those of you who are thinking, and I don't know, but let's say you were thinking, this sounds like we're not going to ask hard-hitting questions. Like we're going to try to be too gentle and too soft when there's like, I have real concerns. I'd almost go so far to say, and this is going to be a radical statement, is that it almost isn't worth it to put conflict on the table. It's much better to be neutral and to ask in a way that points people towards what you want to see. Because as soon as you start into the people sort of circle the wagons and they become defensive. And remember, there's a difference between being right and being effective. You can be right but you can kind of blow it on the delivery with your too much emotion and hard hitting on the people as well as the issue. You want to be hard on the issue, but you want to be soft on the people, and that's what a good director does, and they kind of go under that defensiveness, and it works much better. And hitchhikers will distract and trigger. They think they have to manage you, not the issue. So you want to really put the emphasis on the issue, not on yourself and how. Everybody says, "Oh my God, she's really upset," right? No, you want them to be thinking about what you're suggesting or what you're pointing towards in terms of solutions. And that, of course, fits into this conveying encouragement, this inquisitive energy, and you avoid using you instead talk about we, like why did we do that, not like why did you do that. It would be why do we. You are on the same side psychologically, you're shoulder to shoulder, and the issue is in front of you. It's less threatening. And then you also want to, if you have advice, it's best to phrase it into a question. And that's because it puts the onus in the right place in terms of where the agency is. So, for example, if I said, I think we should contact the city, people then see that as a directive. Like if I'm speaking to management, they see it as a directive to management. And it's better if I was to say, what do you think about us contacting the city? Then management is free to say yes or no. They're not trying to manage my declarative and my instruction to contact the city. So as much as possible, when you have advice, try to phrase it into a question. It will just both work better, and it also allows, you don't know everything. So it acknowledges that you have partial and limited knowledge. And this face forward, you ask questions more about the future than the past. That's the role of a board, is really to, unless you're in some forensic study of something that took place, you are building the future with the questions you have. And that's why I really encourage you to not so much criticize, but say what you want to see. Say what success looks like. Ask for what the goals are in this, because those other conversations, they can derail. Finally, and there's just a couple of slides here, is the oversight framework. And I've used this for many years. What it is, it's really this same A to B, but I kind of see it like toffee. It kind of takes the stages, and instead of, let me mix my metaphors, like kind of an X-ray kind of way, it illuminates questions at every stage. Remember, the board's anticipating the future. It's sense making all the time. It's choosing what it's trying to achieve, what the organization's trying to achieve. And the goal is the resourceful execution to learning, impact, and earned reputation and success. So this is applied overall to a strategy or to a single initiative, or used anywhere along the timeline as projects unfold. But it particularly reflects the board's concern in the fiduciary role. And when we look at something, we can say what needs to go right, what are the opportunities here for learning, what are the impacts, in terms of the organization, in terms of learning, in terms of our developing capabilities for the future, in terms, of course, of stakeholders, et cetera. And we don't just center in all the time on return on investment and metrics. There's a rainbow of questions. And I'm reminded of a chair who recently said to me, he said, what can happen is that you sometimes have management come, and they are very pleased to present something, and it's got lots of nuances, but you have board members who take out their usual, what's the return on investment, or what are the metrics for this, and there's just kind of a collapse. That's something that had a lot more depth is suddenly reduced to just those two questions, which often are overused. But these, illustrative of this 30,000-foot level is the kind of questions that can arise, that boards try to have, because they are interested in that safe transit, from A to B. And there's a very, the thing about A to B is that it's pretty linear, and there is a whole world of change happening around, and there's a constant need to adjust. I'll end with three little quick stories. One is a senior gentleman attended a session on questions I did a few years ago. And at this juncture, he put up his hand and he shared that he was a chair and that these kinds of questions were unnecessary, that they had competent staff and the board trusted the staff. At that point, a young woman put her hand up and I said, yes. And she said, I am an executive director. I expect my board to ask these questions. I am ready for these questions. Basically, she said, bring it on. So these sorts of questions can help staff prepare for the board meeting. And as a balance to that story, not long ago, I was talking with a CEO who had resigned from the organization, and I asked why. And she shared the fact that the board was overly interrogative and drilling with questions at the meeting. And although she loved working with the staff group, it led to her resignation because she didn't feel supported. And I was reminded of the metaphor of the wall and how staff close in the action, they need encouragement, that even from the ground, we can psychologically be side by side. And the third story is just last week, I was talking to a CEO, and he's in a very political situation organizationally, and he's managing it. It's unbelievable. I said, wow. And then I said, yeah, it sounds really challenging. But what do you love about your work? And his eyes lit up and he went on to describe what he loved about what he does. And I could feel him kind of attach again to sort of his role. And I said, does the board or anyone ever ask you that question? He said, or have they? He said, no. And I thought, there you go, right? Like even that question, which is a question to draw out sort of meaning of the work, it costs nothing. All right. What one point or tip will you remember? We as adults remember best what we say ourselves or write down. And you can put it in chat. That would be really cool. And Josh can take a look at that. I'll just end by saying everything I've said about sort of pivoting and retooling for the future applies to what we're doing, TAG. We're taking time, we're on our way to sort of try to address the future differently. And I encourage you as senior leaders to prepare to make a difference, take your role seriously. You have a gift because you have influence somewhere to influence the future if you're on a board. And readying yourselves for authentic conversations to make your organizations and your networks and the future better for those you serve, be it profit or not for profit. And I'm really encouraging you to bring your full and capable selves to the table to have the conversations your board needs now. So thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. And I know we'll have some questions. I'll stop the share. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Lynn. I love the amount of detail and of course your articulate eloquence and explaining all those concepts. While we're in a bit of a transition here, we will post our quick poll that I promised, the 15-second poll. If you could answer it, it'd really help us do better the next time. And if there's any questions, let us know. And then I will also invite you to, if we can share my screen here, our next session. Our next session features Tom. This is going to be November 16th, so a little bit of departure from our third Thursday typical webinar sessions. But how to get the most from your next board retreat or strategic planning session. We'll be joined by Tom Esselin. He's the author and CEO of First Things First, which is a board retreat facilitation provider. He's got some really great thoughts and just some really great energy to amp up your next board retreat. With that, we'll go ahead and close the poll, and I'll get to some of the questions from our audience members as Lynn was speaking. One of the questions, Lynn, as we have a few minutes here, is you mentioned this in the public forum or the public setting, especially with with so many boards being formed for the sake of compliance and risk mitigation. How do you handle questions when your board is bound by a sunshine law? I'm assuming there may be some questions that you don't want to put in the minutes that don't become part of the archive. Is that a matter of subjective choice, or is that you just withhold your questions and put them in an offline format? How would you recommend the directors proceed there?
So I'm assuming that these are questions that directors are asking. So there should be a closed session probably, or, I think in Canada we call it in camera, you might call it executive. So that is where those sorts of questions should go from board members to others in a closed session where there is the ability. Those would be matters of human resources or sensitive contracts or things like that. That is very appropriate. I mean, the board has to have the ability to have its conversations but not drag everything there, but things that legitimately belong.
That's great. Another question, and this is actually came up as part of our podcast interview. We have a podcast series coming up the next couple of weeks here. Lynn will be on one of our great episodes. But what would you recommend in terms of offline questions versus in the moment? As you mentioned, the board's time in session is a deliberative decision-making body. That time is very finite. Should you save questions for an offline format or email directors or managers directly? What about offline questions, so to speak?
Oh, that's a good one. That's really a good one, and we should cover it. So, a board meeting and board business is in the board or in its committees for the most part. And so there's a concept called, I know this isn't necessarily what the person is thinking, but there's a concept of renegade board members who kind of go off and they're asking management and they're getting information. And you have to understand that the board is actually sort of a directing mind of the organization, and each board member, should have the information that supports the decision that they're making. So it isn't, because you're a director, it's not a license to kind of go in and ask, specific questions of specific people. And you certainly would want to work through the lines of reporting, because it is alarming. You're not like anybody else in the organization. You are a board member. So if you contact a management other than the CEO or the executive director, it's uncomfortable for them, because they know that you're kind of out of step with sort of that line of reporting and so forth. So you want to be very sensitive to that. If you have an interest in a particular topic and you want to pursue it separately, then it is good to ask the chair for guidance, or if it's appropriate in flow, to sort of indicate to the board that you will have a very specific interest and you'll pick it up offside because there's not time in the board meeting. But you really want to, it's a self-regulation issue is what it is. You really want to make sure that you're respecting the board and making sure that board business for the most part is at the board. I'm a bit tough on that because there's been a lot of cleanup that we've done when it doesn't work that way.
Yeah, and you speak about that happy balance, and there's kind of two related questions here, and you spoke to the cool medium, which I just love that analogy there. What is the chair's role in creating those open dialogue, those moments of candor, or creating that foundation of a good board culture? And then, if you took that too far, how do you turn down the temperature when there's a lot of questions or a lot of heated debate happening within the boardroom or the committee sessions?
Oh, that's good too. I like that. Well, certainly I spoke about setting the table and inviting everyone's participation and so forth. So there is that, and making sure there's sufficient time. There won't be for everything. I mean, obviously board time is extremely limited, and you want to use consent agendas to maximize the actual board time. So I think there's lots of challenge there, but it's a commitment to making sure the boards have authentic conversations about things that matter. So it's really, everything's calibrated to the relevance of an item. And if there is need for a longer discussion, setting up time for that, or a special board meeting, or asking that, you could even say, we've had a lot of questions about this, and I thank you, Executive Secretary, for recording all of these, but I'm suggesting that what we do is we collect those and maybe we give it to this committee to give some thought to it and bring it back. So there's a bit of a traffic cop kind of making sure that you can not lose those questions, not lose the value of them, but find a way to make them digestible by the board in a way, or it also can be management. There's a lot of questions here around this. Would you mind pulling together sort of your understanding, how you might respond to some of these issues? So, you're trying to, sort of reminds me of, kind of keeping things, belted in enough that you're you don't have a meeting that goes till midnight.
Yeah,
You're,
absolutely.
you're managing it
And I
and
would add, yeah,
respecting it
obviously
still.
the chair's role is to do that pre-read of,
Mhm.
how are you feeling about this meeting? Do you have any questions that we should be talking about ahead of the meeting? And then increasingly we're seeing boards using post-meeting surveys or feedback opportunities to even collect that information anonymously. So if you weren't comfortable posing that question during the session, you can certainly still make sure that it gets submitted into the wider organization. Lynn, thank you so much. Audience members, thank you so much for joining us. This has been one of my favorite sessions as somebody who likes to ask a lot of dumb questions myself. So I really appreciate you taking the time and the wonderful chapter and the second and the third editions of the Handbook of Board Governance. I recommend everybody checking it out. As a follow-up, we will send an email with all the slides and the on-demand session if you'd like to read or watch again. And with that, thank you so much for your time, Lynn. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you very much, Josh. Bye-bye.